Hello and welcome. This media recording accompanies the course Political Science 3501, Introduction to International Relations, taught by Dr. Greg Dixon at the University of West Georgia. This media recording and all other course materials are copyright 2011 by Gregory C. Dixon, and all rights are reserved. Students in Dr. Dixon's courses may copy these files or any other class materials to portable devices, laptop computers, desktop computers, cloud architecture, or whatever other wonderful devices you might want to use in order to follow along and either listen to or watch these presentations, or to read or otherwise use the class information. This lecture is entitled History of the International System, The Making of the Modern World, Part 1, The Rise of the West. This recording is part of a broader course and is not intended to give a complete history of the world. It depends on the reading material for the course as well as a variety of other activities that accompany the class. What this and the subsequent lectures on history are intended to do is provide a quick overview, a survey of world history as it most directly pertains to the international system. This means it is, at best, an incomplete coverage of major events that are most related to what we're studying. It is not meant to be anything more really than a refresher for what students have learned in other courses or on their own regarding the international system. Most importantly, these students are reminded that there is a textbook that covers the history of the international system from the end of World War II up until relatively close to the present day, and that text should be relied upon significantly, as we will be glossing over in these lectures very important things like the Cold War. So, with that caveat, I will move on to the mainstream of the presentation. To begin with, why start with history in an international relations class? Well, part of this process is we want to look at what the impact of the historical process is on bringing us to the international system as we see it today. The international system as it exists is not something that came to us fully formed. It's not the goddess Athena who leaps from the head of Zeus, spear, shield, helmet, ready to fight as a full-grown woman. This is something that emerges much more slowly over time. The process of history has left a very powerful legacy in international affairs. If one wonders why so much of the global south seems very, very powerfully resentful of the advanced industrialized countries of the north, this is true for very, very good historical reasons. They have good reason to be both mistrustful and resentful in some areas. History is not deterministic. We didn't end up here today because there was some inevitable grand press of history that brought us here. Randomness is a frequent contributor to historical events. And this is an important thing to remember. Individual people may find themselves suddenly thrust into moments in which they can have an enormous impact on the history of the world. And many times you don't necessarily know that you will end up in that moment until you are, in fact, in it. History provides us the context of why many of the things in the international system work the way they do, why they are the way they are, and why it is that so many things seem to be part of this big set of institutions and conventions. History tells us how we got there. This is particularly important for us because we will tend to, for most of this class, focus on problems in the modern era. But many of these problems have been long enduring and have their origins many years ago in the historical record. And so we want to keep in mind the fullness of the complexities of what we're talking about while we leave many of those complexities a bit to the side as we move through this introductory course. So it's very important for us to really start with history. It's also important for me to explain very early on that history is not one unified narrative story. History depends greatly upon perspective. There are many, many different ways of looking at the historical progression of the world. What follows for the most part in these lectures is a Western-oriented history. That's not because I think that the Western world is just absolutely neat and everybody should learn all about it. It's because most of the ideas and concepts we discuss in international relations derive from the Western mode of thinking, the Western intellectual tradition. The very term nation is a Western concept, a Western notion, separating the nation from the state. What that means as a political organizing principle is a Western concept. The West has made a huge impact on the world by exporting its ideas out to the rest of the world. As often as not at the end of a bayonet, but certainly regardless of the means of delivery, these ideas have had huge, huge impacts on the rest of the world. The entire international system today is characterized by political organizations that are essentially organized around some version of a Western form of organization. There's a lot of controversy in making that case, but we assume, both intellectually in the study of international relations and in our systems of international law under the United Nations Charter, that all of the countries in the world that are recognized as such are nation states which have particular characteristics such as sovereignty, which derive from what was essentially a Western series of events. Now, it has been embraced to at least some degree worldwide, although it's also been embraced sometimes in opposition. You accept it and fight against it. You accept that people with guns have imposed this on you, and we're going to fight against it. But it is a central point of international relations that we derive much of our ideas from Western thinking. This is slowly changing with the rise of many of the developing countries coming along, but for the most part, we're still there. The fact that I focus on the Western orientation does not discount other orientations. It's just a matter of time. There are several other major world historical traditions that could also be used to look at world history, as well as almost a countless number of different smaller traditions that are out there. I would highlight, though, for purposes of example, that the Islamic world historical tradition and Confucian world historical traditions both provide alternatives and would give a very different view of the modern international system if you told the history of the world from the standpoint of these other traditions. For the Islamic world historical tradition, it is not the rise of the scrappy group of people who overcome these other groups to establish a great civilization. It's actually the downfall of a great civilization. Islamic civilization was far and away the most advanced in the world for a number of centuries, and clearly was the dominant global power, at least to the extent that you can speak of that in the older periods of time, and yet they significantly fell from that point. And so in the Islamic tradition, much of what we talk about as a rise of the West would be seen as the fall of the existing civilization. Something similar can be said for the Confucian tradition and others. So just to give everyone fair warning up front, this is predominantly a Western-oriented perspective on history. Any students who are interested in seeing the perspectives from the views of others should let me know either in class or via email, and I can suggest some alternate readings and some ways to get you started on exploring some of these alternate traditions. A good starting point for our discussion is to begin with the idea that globalization, this phenomenon that we talk about in which human beings are interconnected all over the world, is not in any way, shape, or form a new phenomenon. It is not new. Globalization has been around as long as people have been around. Human beings evolve in their modern form in Africa and spread to every habitable corner of the planet. takes us a while. The speed of globalization is really slow. It's how fast can you walk there, carrying sufficient supplies that you won't die along the way or when you get there. So globalization starts off slow, but will accelerate as human technology advances, very slowly early on. By 1400, Europe, Africa, and Asia are all bound together in what can be referred to as a hemispheric trade system. We generally divide the world into the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere, although these divisions are somewhat disputed today. They're useful for us in the context of the world of 1400. And Africa, Europe, and Asia are all bound together in this system. Mongol conquests have opened Central Asian trade routes where goods and people may flow. Chinese and Arab traders have linked Africa, the Middle East, as well as Asia by sea through a whole series of land routes. And these are going to be very important because what this means is the world that is known to the peoples of these areas is bound together, is tied together. You can get goods from almost anywhere if you have enough money. And so much of the system that we would think of as sort of a global trade network has been built. If you're watching this presentation or if you're following along with the audio looking at the PowerPoint slides, we're going to look at a series of slides that demonstrate this. The first is a slide showing maritime trade routes in 1335. And you can see a number of trade routes in different colors that follow different monsoons and things like that. But this shows you very clearly how all of the various trade routes in Asia and Africa and into the Middle East can be bound together here in a system that combines Chinese and Arab traders along with some African traders in the local trade in Africa and some Central Middle Eastern traders in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, all in this grand system. And you can see that these maritime trade routes really bind a whole series of different peoples together. And generally they tended to follow the monsoons. That's why you have these monsoonal arrows in there telling you where to go. But basically what we have here is a system in which maritime trade routes will bind everyone together. Land trade routes here in 1300, so roughly contemporaneous with the previous slide. And you can see that the Mongol conquests and the successor states that follow them, these are the successors of the original conquests of Genghis Khan, they've bound together via land trade routes almost the entire Eurasian landmass. Now, if you put these trade routes in with the trade routes that were shown in the last slide, you'll see that while land trade routes will take you into the Middle East, the maritime trade routes will certainly take you throughout most of Africa. A subsequent slide will deal with some other trade routes that show how the rest of Africa is brought into this. But you can see that the land trade routes here trickle into Poland and Hungary over the land system. The final slide here is of African trade routes in 1350. You can see how the traders in the Islamic states of North Africa have been able to bind land trade routes that put pretty much all of Africa, with the exception of a handful of territories in southwest Africa, all bound together in this one trade system. And even southwest Africa was very loosely connected through a number of other trading systems, slower trading systems to the rest of the world, but much more intermittently. The trade routes that are shown on these maps, generally speaking, are the trade routes that were enduring. One of the other things that's important, just as a side note, is if you'll notice in this map of Africa, there are a number of major countries, major imperial states that are shown here. When we talk about colonialism and we talk about the difficulty of Europeans penetrating where these civilizations existed, it's important to remember that Africa has many of these civilizations in there as well. While we tend to discount them in many of the college courses that we see in the West, one of the reasons that Western imperial powers have difficulty penetrating Africa, other than disease and other things like that, is that there are organized states there that can offer resistance to the Western imperial overstretch. So while they are not normally discussed widely in Western history textbooks, it's important to remember that there's a long history of major civilizations and empires in Africa as well in this time period that will experience a decline, which eventually does allow the Europeans in the age of industrial colonialism to overwhelm them. So we start in 1400, and we're looking at whether or not we can predict what the future will hold. And if we try this, and if we take the best evidence available to us in 1400, we would get almost everything that has happened since then wrong. If we look for the big up-and-coming powers, the big countries with resources, highly organized civilizations, the people that are really likely to have a major impact on the world, Europe wouldn't appear anywhere. No European power would appear on this list. The Chinese and Indian civilizations both look like they should be on the rise, ready to dominate. In fact, China will be building ships of such size and technological sophistication they won't be matched until the 1800s, long after the age of exploration in Europe. Tuantinsuyu, this is the empire of the Incas, is conquering what will be one of the largest empires ever created anywhere in southern Latin America. Tuantinsuyu actually is one of the most highly organized empires. They were a very centralized state. The army of the Inca never, ever was defeated in battle by anyone other than other Incas. So it was only when family members fought for who was going to take control that they were actually defeated. Eventually, the conquistadors will defeat them not through pitched battle, but through deception, subversion, and the help of a variety of diseases, which will wipe the population out. The Aztec Empire similarly really looks like an up-and-coming empire, although they will very quickly run into the problem of not being able to fully conquer everybody around them for fear that if you can no longer take people in battle, you will see the world end, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Europe is a backward and divided hellhole. It is terrible. If you look at Europe, it's awful. It is a place that no sane person would want to live in this period. If you had to pick a place that you wanted to live, you would have picked some place like Baghdad, which was a much, much better place to live. You would have lived in any number of cities in China or India before you would take anything in Europe. Europe was a poor, divided backwater, absorbed in part in a series of what are just starting to be religious movements and a turmoil in the church. There's an enormously complicated set of events that are going to happen in the 1400s that are going to propel Europe on what is a truly phenomenal rise to global domination. By 1500, 100 years after we've started our observation, Europe is on the rise, and you can see in Europe this burgeoning sense of expansion, a changing of the power relationship. By 1900, Europe completely dominates the entire world. There are no large civilizations left that compete effectively with European civilization. Even the great civilizations in the Middle East and in China have begun trying to adopt European models of organization as a means of modernizing. So what happened? How did we go from 1400, where anybody who said Europe was the way of the future would have been laughed out of any place you were discussing this with? Europe had no chance of being a dominant power. How do we go from that to Europe dominating the world? And that is somewhat of the story that we're going to tell as this lecture continues and as we work through subsequent lectures. Most importantly, we're also going to look at the consequences of that. Non-European empires don't capitalize on their dominant positions. China was poised to become a global power. But China had always been inward looking. The idea had always been that it was the Middle Kingdom, it was the civilization amidst barbarism everywhere, and that people should acknowledge China's superiority and come to China. The idea that China would go forth into the world was not something that was part of the culture of Chinese government. And in 1400s, you had a temporary set of circumstances in which an emperor who had started out as a commoner and fought his way into imperial control had imposed briefly this idea that China would go out to the world. And that's where the great treasure fleets get built. This is the Zheng-He voyages that have become somewhat controversial with the argument that they may have mapped the entire world, circumnavigated the globe, and even made contact with a number of civilizations in the Americas. That's highly controversial. Whether or not that happened is the matter of some debate. Most historians say no, but a handful of people say yes. In terms of the technology, it was technically feasible for the Chinese to have done this. Whether they did or not is still a matter of debate. We can look at India, we can look at the rising Ottomans, we can look at Tawantinsuyu or the Aztec Empire, we can look at any number of these empires, but what we see consistently is that they will not turn their dominant early position into global dominance for a variety of different reasons, and some of which will have to do with the rise of Europe, others have to do with internal issues. Europe experiences a series of shock events, and these shock events are going to have profound implications in Europe. Probably one of the most important is the Black Death. This is one of a series of outbreaks of the plague, usually bubonic plague with some attendant sort of follow-on effects and other diseases that are opportunistic in its wake. But the Black Death is the most devastating of these. Depending on whose numbers you want to look at and what part of Europe you're talking about, somewhere between a third and half of the population of Europe died in waves of the plague starting in 1348. This is going to create huge problems. For one thing, you've got a lot of deeply, deeply religious people. In terms of the modern era, you can imagine the devotion of the average person living in Christendom in Europe, and they would all be almost fundamentalist today. They were very, very deeply absorbed with religion. The problem then is, how do you explain in Christendom what is supposed to be a benevolent and loving God killing one person in three in this really, truly horrible way? And this leads to an entire range of questions that had been percolating in the background in intellectual circles to become part of major and significant debates in society about what should be the future of how politics, social systems, and everything else works. So you get very powerful questioning of the church. Did God send the plagues because the church has become corrupt? Did God send the plagues because our temporal rulers have become corrupt? What is going on? There's also a whole series of economic effects. Labor, all of the sudden, is at a premium because you have this boom in population in the century before the Black Death. There was a very big rise in prosperity. People had been doing pretty well for themselves. This was something that had trickled down even to the lower elements of society, and then bam, here comes the Black Death. Well, all of a sudden, labor is at a premium. This is going to lead a number of countries to engage in major changes and innovations. In some countries, you get a transformation in serfdom into where serfs become locked onto the land. We're going to solve the labor problem by not letting people go anywhere. We're going to lock them to the land, and they are going to effectively become a form of slave. It is not going to be the same sort of medieval sense of obligation with an obligation that goes in two directions and the freedom of people, if they're willing to pay the consequences to break it. People are going to literally become almost slaves upon the land. And in Eastern Europe, this is fairly common. The solution to the labor shortage is to tie people directly to the land. In England, there is a very different system because you have here primogeniture, you have here a very different sort of set of traditions about the relationship between the ruler and ruled. And what happens is all of a sudden, certain people, the survivors, become much richer if they're in the propertied class, because they're inheriting all of the wealth of the people that are dying. People who can offer to work for wages can demand much higher wages. So you have people now who have money to spend, and you have people who are demanding higher wages, and so there's a change, a shift in the economy that will begin following the Black Death and spur somewhat the move towards what will be a centuries-long process of consolidating wealth and moving to a wage-oriented system rather than a barter system or a feudally oriented economy such as what we see before this. And so the Black Death is going to have this big transforming impact, and many of these things take several centuries to shake out, but it puts in motion a whole series of intellectually, socially, politically, and economically transformative processes. Well, in the middle of the 1400s, there's going to be an event that has absolutely enormous symbolic significance for all of Christendom. And this is the fall of Constantinople to the Turk in 1453. Now, it's important to remember that Constantinople, going back to ancient history, is a city that has been around for millennia. It is a city that is literally several thousand years old. But what makes it really significant is the fact that the Roman Emperor Constantine, who is the emperor that, after winning the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, issues an edict of toleration that says Christians may worship freely throughout the empire. He believes that the Christian God has helped to give him victory in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. This is the famous where he has the vision in the dream of the Chi Rho, an early symbol of Christianity, and his men paint this upon their shields, and they win a battle they should not have otherwise won against overwhelming odds. And essentially, then this leads Constantine to accept Christianity. He will convert on his deathbed, but prior to this, he puts an enormous amount of money and time into promoting Christianity. Well, part of his efforts to do this are to build a new capital for the Roman Empire in what had been the city of Byzantium, which will now be renamed Constantinople after Constantine. It becomes the city of Constantine. And he builds this city into a golden, shimmering capital of the new Christian Roman world. When the Roman Empire falls in the West to a whole series of barbarian invasions, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, will continue to survive until 1453. Now, by 1453, it's very much reduced, but it has an enormously powerful symbolic significance in the minds of the various people in all of Christendom, because it's this shining city sacred to the Virgin Mary that has stood against the onslaught of the Muslims since the very first wave of Muslim conquests. They had tried to take the city repeatedly and always failed. Well, in 1453, there's a new emperor in town, Mehmed II, who is one of the great conquering leaders of all of world history, and he isn't messing around. He brings brand new firearms, brand new cannon technology in particular, and he lays out very well organized, very clearly thought through plans for taking the city of Constantinople. And he will eventually take the city. And this is going to have a huge impact because nobody could really believe that this city would fall. They'd been under threat for just countless generations. And yet the city had always stood. And the city of Constantinople was a shadow of its former self. What was left of the Byzantine Empire was a tiny handful of scraps, completely surrounded by the Ottoman Turks. But people don't appreciate these changes until there's some big, shocking event that breaks kind of the old way of seeing things. And this is the fall of Constantinople. One of the greatest churches in all of Christendom, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, is converted into a mosque. It's still one of the most beautiful religious structures that exists anywhere in the world, and it is today still there in the modern city of Istanbul, which is the renaming of Constantinople once it had been taken by the Turks. Well, so this shock event is going to absolutely scare Western Europeans to the bone, and this is going to be followed by the acceleration of a process that was already going underway, which is the revolution in military affairs that's taking place in Europe in the 15th century. And so what you've got is a Europe that is very much feeling weak and on the defensive, that will be partially compensating for this by engaging in a massive radical reorganization of military forces, to move away from feudal armies to much more professional armies equipped with what will, by the end of this revolution in military affairs, be the most advanced cannon and firearms in the world. They will overtake all others by the time we get to 1500. And they are implementing in their wars with each other what is essentially a modernized version of the classical Greek warfare that engages in huge shock battles where you line your armies up and hammer at each other until one side has been essentially crushed and defeated, and then essentially at that point the war ends with the crushing defeat of your enemies. And so this Western model of warfare is going to be one of the things that Europe will export to the world. Well, what's going to happen then is the age of discovery, which is typically presented to you in your high school history textbooks as a bunch of wily Europeans going out for gold, God, and glory, and off into the world they go with this big sense of confidence, and they're going to go out and conquer the world, and they're going to bring the world into this European system. But that's what it looks like to us today. At the time, they didn't go on these voyages because they were happy and saw things as being good. They were desperately afraid. They saw this giant evil power, the Turk, who had this alien and, to European eyes, evil religion of Islam, trying to go convert them. Interestingly, to the people who were on the Turkish side, you had these crazy, scary barbarians who had to be tamed and brought into civilization. So it was actually kind of interesting in that the typical East-West conflict that traces its origins all the way back into Zoroastrian Persia and pagan Greece still is essentially manifesting itself in a very similar way in this period of time. But in this part of the cycle, it's the West that is on the defensive. You have to remember that the voyages of discovery, when you hear this handful of names, it's because those are the only ones that survived. The death rates on these voyages were above 90%. The vast majority of the people who went out on these voyages of exploration never made it home alive. And you don't go out on a mission in which there's a 95% chance that you're going to die because you're really happy and are trying to go find a way to make some extra money for yourself. But if you are desperate and fearful, you'll take these kinds of risks. It's the scrappy, desperate people who have nothing else to lose that will take these extreme risks. We think of the explorers in the 1500s the people who knew there was gold and all this stuff out there to go get, we think of them as our model. They were walking in the footsteps of others. They were walking in the footsteps of people who didn't know what was going on out there, who thought that the seas boiled if you got far enough south. Nobody thought the world was flat. That's a myth. At this point, everybody knew the world was round. But they all thought that the world was simply too big. Ironically, Columbus undertook the voyage because he did his math wrong. Had he done his math right, he would have thought that the sea was too vast to cross. He did his math wrong and got lucky and tripped over the Americas. But the age of discovery is an accident. It's desperate people looking desperately for help in a time of dire crisis. There were all sorts of rumors, such as that the great legend of Prester John, who was this Christian king off somewhere in the world who had this large, wealthy, powerful empire, and if the Europeans could just get to him, they could convince him to attack the Turk from the other side and make the Turk fight a two-front war and maybe save Europe from being overrun. It's probably origins of the Christian kingdom, has its origin in the myths that trickled into Europe of the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia, which is modern Ethiopia, which is an empire that traces its line all the way back to the biblical King David, and that actually makes it well into the 20th century before it is eventually transformed into the modern first socialist and now semi-authoritarian socialist state of Ethiopia. Well, one of the things that the Age of Discovery is going to do is it is going to establish for the first time a truly global trade system. Europeans will begin to displace local traders throughout the world. There are a number of innovations in shipbuilding and other things, financially and otherwise, that will allow the Europeans to engage in these voyages and eventually displace local traders everywhere. At least everywhere early on that they can do it by boat. They can't really penetrate where there are existing civilizations, but they can use their naval supremacy to essentially take over the sea routes. The Americas in this story are a particularly tragic part of the story, but they also are a particularly important part of the story. The European impact on the Americas is massive, huge, by any stretch of the imagination. At the most basic level, the Age of Discovery finds the Americas and brings the Americas into what had previously been this Eastern Hemisphere trade system. The Americas had a trading system within the Americas. It was nowhere near as sophisticated for regions that largely have to do with geography and a lack of large domesticable animals. But we do know that there was an intermittent trade system that did exist in the Americas. And we know that there was periodic random contact between the Americas and other parts of the world. However, those were never sustained. And so America, while we had periodic occasions of Polynesians and others coming in here, nothing was ever sustained. So no permanent contacts were built. Well, with the Europeans, permanent contacts will be formed. And so the Americas will be linked into the world trade system without really having much choice in the matter. Probably one of the biggest impacts is that European diseases will wipe out the vast majority of the population of the Western Hemisphere. Now, these numbers are highly controversial. The dominant theme in understanding North America, Central America, and South America for years was something that is occasionally called the empty continent hypothesis. This is the idea that there was almost nobody living in the Americas, and when the Europeans got here, their excess population just kind of filled it in. But there was always a problem, which is that the earliest Spanish explorers really had a very different picture than the ones who came 100 years later of these far-off lands. The earliest Spanish explorers, Portuguese explorers, and others write of these big cities, these large civilizations, these big areas that have thousands and thousands of people living in large agricultural societies. But then 100 years later, when the next round of explorers show up, these are all gone. The explanation used to be that the first folks were trying to get later people to come, and so they just made it all up. Modern archaeology suggests that they didn't make it all up, that there were, in fact, very large-scale civilizations that had existed all over the Americas. Exactly how many people lived here is hugely controversial. I happen to buy, and I tend to believe the evidence for a very large population of the Americas. As they find more and more and more evidence for this, it looks more and more like this is true, although it's still controversial. And I would defer to my colleagues in the history department on the details. But I accept that there was a very large population here. I accept from some of the argument about the genetics of disease that this population was going to be susceptible to diseases that had emerged on the Eurasian landmass after the last sustained contacts of the peoples that migrated here, and that essentially what happened was you had a number of very virulent diseases that Europeans had been exposed to for centuries or even millennia, and essentially had gotten to the point where largely most adults were not necessarily immune, but had enough disease resistance that the death rates were low enough that people could survive. In the Americas, these were not present, and so the diseases like smallpox will sweep through the Americas and have a devastating effect. In these trade routes in the West, you'll have these diseases reaching places that they could not have reached through European contact. So that's, in my view, a big part of what happens. And so you get a massive die-off of the population. The empires of the Americas will collapse under the combined pressure of this disease, and in areas where we have Europeans who were present to document it, we know that disease had an absolutely devastating impact. For instance, on the Aztec Empire, smallpox killed far more people than any Spaniard ever did. And these empires will collapse under that pressure. What this is going to mean is that the Americas are going to become integrated very early on into the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires in a way that no other society is at this period of history. When the Spanish and the Portuguese, and later the British, the Dutch, the French, and others get to India, they find highly advanced, well-organized, well-armed civilizations that don't particularly want to be displaced by Europeans and simply don't allow the Europeans to displace them. In the Americas, it is not clear that the civilizations that fell to the Europeans would have done so without the disease that followed these initial European contacts. It's not clear that the native peoples would not have simply reorganized themselves and fought off the Europeans. With the impact of disease, however, you get a social, political, religious, and military collapse that allows the Europeans to take over. And so what's going to happen is the Spanish and Portuguese export to the Americas their domestic political systems. And when we talk about colonialism, this is going to be an important element of it. Who colonized you matters. The Spanish and Portuguese are going to export a feudal system in which the local native population and then the slave populations that are brought in for a labor force as the native population dies off, they are peasants. And the aristocracy sits on top. So if you want to understand why Latin America has the greatest wealth inequality of any continent in the world, or of any part of the world, I guess region would be the appropriate term to use, one of the explanations is that they had their political systems in the colonial era modeled on this feudal system. And when you get revolutions, it's a revolution of the local aristocracy against the European aristocracy, not rebellions by the bottom, the peasants, against the landowners. This is going to be a big deal because the European export of the political systems leaves this whole structure down to us, all the way up to the present day. Western political systems are going to be exported and set up all over the world. The Portuguese and Spanish bring this semi-feudal system. The French and the British bring their systems. Later, the Germans will bring theirs. And what's happening is the international system that will be created through these centuries of globalization is one that will be built on European political ideas, because it's the Europeans that will be imposing political order on the areas they integrate into their colonial empires. So why is it that we live in a world of nation states? It's because the Europeans will export that model to the world. Where does the nation state model come from? Well, it's an accident of history. It's not really something that happened by design. Several centuries after the turmoil of the 1400s, there's going to be a war, the 30 Years' War, that takes place in Europe. This is a war over religion. In the intervening years, we have the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, it divides Europe along religious lines. Protestants versus Catholics. And these kingdoms will use religion as a mechanism for going to war. And what's going to result with the completion of the revolution of military affairs that begins in the 1400s and comes to fruition with the organization of a whole series of new types of armies in the mid-1600s, in the time of the 30 Years' War, we're going to see a huge transformation in warfare that's going to make warfare extremely devastating and deadly by traditional standards. And because armies are getting larger and because they have to be more professional, they start to have a bigger impact on the organization of states. So what's going to happen is the 30 Years' War is this incredibly brutal war. It's probably the most devastating war Europe has seen since the fall of the Roman Empire. And when it's all said and done, the leaders of the major fighting countries are going to sit down at an event called the Peace of Westphalia. And this is a peace conference that's designed to reorder the European political system so that they can avoid wars like this in the future. And it's Westphalia that will mark the start of the modern state system. So when you hear the international system of today labeled Westphalian, that is because it is this peace, the Peace of Westphalia, that will usher in, largely by accident, the modern state system. Now, someone doesn't throw a switch at the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia and all of a sudden we have a world of nation states. What's going to happen at the Peace of Westphalia is the answer to how we can stop a war like this from happening again is to look at what caused the war. In this case, religion. How can we make it so that religion will not plunge Europe into wars? It's important to remember that people felt insanely, by modern standards, passionate about these basic questions. Take the most passionate social conservative you know, and they are nothing compared to the way people felt about religion in this time. I mean, people were absolutely obsessed with the fact that if you picked the wrong religion, you were damning everyone to hell. And so people fought very, very hard for these kinds of religious questions. And so if you could find a way to take religion away as a motivator for war, this is something that was seen as a way to stop these great hegemonic wars, to use our modern term for it. And so at the Peace of Westphalia, people come up with this idea that the ruler will pick the religion of the country in the sense that whatever religion the ruler of the country follows is what the country will follow. There's a vague sense of, oh, and we'll tolerate other people, but the idea here is that no outside country can come in and interfere in the internal affairs of any country in matters of religion. This is going to give birth to the nation state. The nation state is the central actor in international relations. It's the key actor. The United States is a nation state. Great Britain, China, Brazil, India, all of our modern countries, even countries that don't actually exist in a practical sense as a nation state, like Somalia, are treated that way in contemporary international law and jurisprudence, and to a certain degree also in how we conceive of things, because of what came out of Westphalia. And the key thing is this idea of non-interference. No outside power may interfere, first, in the religion of the country. The ruler's religion will be the religion of the country. This will later be expanded to more generally include the internal affairs of the state. When you hear people today looking at the Arab Spring in North Africa and culminating today in Libya and Syria, and you hear arguments about the internal affairs, this is something that's an internal matter of the country, the outside world should butt out. This is because sovereignty establishes this. And originally it was a religious concept, a way to avoid religious wars. But over time it will come to cover pretty much everything. And so sovereignty is a key part of the nation state. And the nation state will emerge as the key actor in the Westphalian system. The traditional definition of a nation state actually comes from a guy named Max Weber, who argued that there are two notions of organization, the nation and the state. And he combined the two to form something called the nation state. So the term nation state doesn't come into use until the late 1800s, although what we can observe and call nation states begin to exist much earlier. But the traditional definition is a geographically defined area, that's the state part, in which a people with a shared sense of common identity, that's the nation part, live. So a state is a specific geographic area with political boundaries. Everything within this political boundary is this state. And a nation, a people with a shared common identity. In the United States, our shared common identity is a belief in the American dream. If you work hard, you can get ahead. Everybody is basically equal in the opportunities that they should be afforded. Outcomes, not remotely equal. We accept very unequal outcomes. Some will succeed, some will fail. We do not have an ethnic or linguistic identity in the United States. And yes, I know a whole bunch of Tea Party folks just stood up and raised their fists in the back room. We don't. What we consider to be the American core identity is consistently, from the beginning, about hard work and opportunity. We change what it means to be an American. It used to be you couldn't be American if you were from Ireland or Scotland because those are Celtic countries. And we used to treat the Celtic peoples as if they were a separate racial group. So all the way up until really the Second World War, they were considered separate. The Italians, because they were Catholic, were considered different, and so on. It doesn't matter how you organize that common identity. You just have to share a common identity. So the United States is a nation state in which the common identity is an ideological one, not a religious, ethnic, or linguistic one. As a practical definition, though, many nation states do not fit this classic definition. We can take the Kurds. They are a nation. They have a shared sense of identity. They have no state. It's divided up. The Kurds are split between 4 other countries. They are a nation without a state. There are many states that have multiple nations in them. The state of the United Kingdom has the Northern Irish, the Welsh, and the Scots, as well as the English. So you can have multiple groups in practice. What we typically see today is that all of the countries that we recognize as independent countries, we call them nation states, whether or not they meet the traditional definition. So in practice, any country that we recognize as independent, we call a nation state, even if it's not technically accurate to do so. So we might say Somalia is a nation state when it is essentially a failed state. It has no effective government at all, no sense of common identity, and essentially it isn't really even something that you can call a country in the traditional sense because it effectively has no governance within it. But we treat it as though it does in international relations. Sometimes you'll see in international relations our vocabulary causes tensions, which we resolve by usually inventing new vocabulary like failed state to accompany it. But there's also an international legal reason why we do these things. And we'll talk about this stuff as we talk about sovereignty in the United Nations Charter and other elements of the course. When we think of nation states in international relations, they have a number of characteristics that we associate with them. First, they're sovereign. No outside power can interfere in the internal affairs of a given state legitimately. That word legitimately is going to be very important because as we look at what sovereignty is going to imply in the international system, that's going to lead to some problems. Nation states have fixed geography. The United States can't suddenly decide that it wants to go someplace else. We can't pack up, move, and suddenly make the Australian landmass the United States. Not without conquering it, which leads to problems of this internal sovereignty issue. So nation states have fixed geography. Nation states have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within their borders. Within the United States, the People's Republic of China can't come in, put a gun to someone's head, and arrest them or kill them. Within the United States, the government of the United States can put a gun to your head, force you to comply with law, and ultimately kill you if you choose not to. We don't like to think about that, but all law in domestic circumstances is ultimately dependent on the sword. The nation state has the legitimate monopoly on the use of force within their borders. If you break the law seriously enough, police will come for you. And if you resist, they will use force up to and including deadly force to make you comply with law. And if the U.S. government does that, it is considered legitimate because they do ultimately have the right to do that. Now, we have a whole system in place that sets what is legitimate within our domestic interest, but in an international sense, nobody would think twice about it. The nation states also are going to have a wide range of domestic political systems. Democracies, authoritarian regimes, mixed regimes, all over the map. And these will have an impact on how nation states sometimes behave, but the variation is very, very wide. And this will come up repeatedly in the course. The key principle here is that of sovereignty. No outside power may legitimately interfere in the internal affairs of any state. Why is this key? From the idea at Westphalia that no one could come in and fiddle with the religious affairs of the country evolves a general prohibition against outside powers interfering in the internal affairs of countries. All of modern international law, with a handful of exceptions, is predicated on the sovereignty principle. And even the exceptions include specific mechanisms for overriding sovereignty. So even in the very few cases where sovereignty can be gotten around, it is an explicitly recognized exception because of the horror of the crimes that are involved. So the core principle of the international system today, the core characteristic that leads to the defining character of the international system, is sovereignty. Protection from interference from the outside. But we have a problem in the world of today. Globalization has progressed and accelerated and gotten much faster and is embedding much more deeply in the world in which we live than at any other time in human history. And so sovereignty is under pressure. In fact, there are some who argue that sovereignty should be abandoned as an organizing principle. We should get rid of the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of a country completely. Is sovereignty still meaningful in a time where American banks' exposure to European country debts mean that the Dow Jones Industrial Average in the United States can crash and lose 10% of its value because of a European financial crisis? Does sovereignty matter when the United States depends on the People's Republic of China to finance 20 cents of every dollar the U.S. government spends? How independent is the United States from Chinese meddling if we're that dependent on them? And note that I'm saying here that the biggest, most powerful country in the world, the United States, has its sovereignty eroded. Now imagine you're a tiny country. Imagine what's happening to your sovereignty in this kind of an environment. Norms are also changing. We've seen some monumentally horrific things in the last 150 years. And there's a general sense in the international community, to the extent that we can define such a thing, that that stuff is horrible. Genocide is beyond the pale. After the Second World War, when the Genocide Convention was being written, it included the first systematic violation of sovereignty in contemporary international law. Arguably, you could make the case that it allows the first legitimate exception to international law since the sovereignty principle was first put into place. If genocide is being committed, states do not just have the right to intervene, they are obliged to intervene to stop genocide. If you've ever wondered why it seems like people in powerful positions go to insanely great lengths not to use the word genocide, that's why. Norms are changing. We accept intervention in ways we didn't used to. Ask Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He's a bad guy with no friends. The international community intervened against him. These things are still haphazard because we're in the midst of a transformation. But sovereignty clearly here is under pressure and in question. Non-state actors are growing more and more powerful. Walmart has sales that are greater than the gross domestic product of many countries. So where do they fit? How do they fit into the system? A big multinational corporation. Where do they fit? International institutions like the African Union, the United Nations, the European Union, where do they fit? Those are non-state actors. So sovereignty is under pressure, and we're going to be coming back to this theme again and again and again throughout the class. Well, sovereignty, because it implies that no outside power can intervene, implies that no foreign power can compel a nation-state to do anything within its borders. There's no higher authority that can say, you can't do this, or you must do this to another nation-state. What this means is that the international system is going to be very different from domestic political systems that you're used to. The international system is an anarchic international system. Anarchy prevails. Now, this doesn't mean that we all just run around screaming and yelling and throwing Molotov cocktails and singing weird songs, getting drunk all the time. It's not that kind of anarchy. It's an ordering principle. There is no higher authority, so there is no governance mechanism that can coerce compliance. Everybody is technically equal in an anarchic system. How can we think about this in a way that will touch on the domestic political systems that we're used to and that we've grown up in? Well, think about it this way. You've grown up in a country that is ordered, but it's not ordered anarchically, it's ordered hierarchically. Members are not equal. The President of the United States has more decision-making authority than I do. A member of Congress has more decision-making authority than you do. A police officer has more decision-making authority. A judge has more decision-making authority than the police officer or me. That judge has a whole other series of judges above that judge that can be used in appeal. Members are not equal in authority. Legitimate authority in a hierarchy can coerce everybody down the chain. If I'm driving down the street and a police officer says, pull over, by flashing his lights, and I don't pull over, that police officer can use force to make me stop. And when you see these high-speed chases on television and the cops eventually pull the guy over and wrestle him to the ground and arrest him, nobody really questions the fact that the police had the right to wrestle to them to the ground and question them, because the police have their position in the hierarchy. And there are lots of different examples of this, but basically legitimate authority is allowed to coerce. There is an ultimate authority in the United States. That's the governing institutions of the federal government of the United States. Ultimately, the Supreme Court will decide if actions of everybody else are constitutional or not. We have a system for this. The international system is not like that. The international system is characterized by anarchy. All members are equal in authority. If they're all equal in authority, how do you tell one from the other? Power distinguishes members. The United States, big and powerful. Vanuatu, little and weak. There is no legitimate mechanism for any member of the system to coerce other members of the system to do things that they do not want to do. Now, that doesn't mean we don't coerce. That just means it's not legitimate. This is one of the great challenges of international relations. If the international system is truly ordered by anarchy, then how do you cooperate? How do you go about engaging in stable relations over time? Some theorists will argue against the anarchy principle. Or more accurately, some will argue against it, others will argue against its centrality, but essentially, for most approaches to international relations, there is this idea that the international system is ordered very differently. That because there's no legitimate authority, all members are equal, therefore, you don't have a system in which you can go appeal to somebody else. And this can lead to a wide range of conclusions in terms of how the international system will work on a daily basis. Well, Westphalia is the starting point that will essentially set us on the path to where we are today. The foundations of today's international system were set down at Westphalia, and the system will evolve over time as the result of actions by the great powers. Part of this is that they will export the European model of politics through the entire world through the colonial system. The colonial system is going to be the imposition of Western political, social, and economic models on the rest of the world through military and economic coercion. Make no mistake about it. When we talk about colonialism, we're talking about force applying it. But it is this European model based increasingly on this notion of the nation state, organized in what will increasingly be a centralized way. That's what we're going to export to everybody else. That's what gets exported, that's what gets adopted, and the default model in today's world is the model that originates with Westphalia. So, to wrap up this section of the course, we've seen the emergence of the West, the reasons why the West, in its desperation, goes out into the world and explores the world and transports what will be a very particular system of political organization and political order out to the rest of the world, and will impose that system through force in the subject of our next lecture, which is colonialism.